Welcome to the first session on the energy review. Here I will give you an overview of the scope and the principles of the energy review. So let's get started. This is called a Sankey diagram, and it gives a good summary of what you want to do in an energy review. The review is basically about getting a detailed understanding of what different sources of energy are, as well as where within the business the energy is consumed. This is also referred to as the energy balance. The width of the arrows here in this graph is proportional to the amount of energy, meaning that wide arrows correspond to large volumes of energy and vice versa. Now this diagram here gives us a quick overview and an understanding of where the energy comes from and where it is used. In this example, the scope of the review and the resulting diagram is the US, while in your case the scope could be your company, a certain plant or a certain building or a certain process or activity. Setting this scope is the first and most important thing that you need to do when starting the review. Before we continue adding details to the scope, let's talk a bit about independence, as this is an important factor to consider to ensure that you get an objective and honest review. So, the review should be done by someone who is independent from the unit or company being reviewed. Now, if the company subject to the review is large, then it can work just fine with an employee of the same company, but he or she should not be directly involved with the operation of the unit being reviewed. One should also be very careful to use suppliers who either have delivered equipment previously or may deliver equipment in the future that is in any way related to energy consumption, as their impartiality and incentives may be questioned. Regardless of who you decide to use as a reviewer, this topic of independence is something that should be brought up and discussed transparently between the reviewer and representatives of the company or the unit that is under review. Now, back to the scope of the review. We need to decide what parts of our business that should be included. Of course, the larger the scope, the more time-consuming and costly the review, but also the more likely you are to find potential for improvement. So it will no doubt be a trade-off here between expected costs and benefits. Something that you should be very careful with is consistency. What do I mean by that? Well, remember that you will end up with some measurements on energy performance, such as kilowatt hours per produced unit, for example. If you hope to be able to compare these with other similar companies or units, or even track the development of your own performance over time, you need to make sure that you are comparing apples with apples. In other words, that the scope of what is included in the reviews or the measurements is the same. When doing the review, you should at least make sure that you get an overall view of energy input and consumption, both in terms of units of energy consumed and the costs of the different energy sources. Next, you need to make sure that the areas of significant energy use are looked at in a little bit more detail, and also the areas in which there are believed to be considerable savings potential. Is this not the same, you might think? Well, it could be, but it doesn't have to. For example, a company may have invested heavily recently in some production equipment and opted for top-of-the-line equipment in terms of energy efficiency. Then this equipment may be the largest consumer of energy, but not necessarily the area where you find the largest improvement potential. To determine where there's considerable cost savings and improvement potential, it of course helps if you've done this before and have a rough idea about what these processes that you're looking at, how much they should consume. Regardless of how you decide to define the scope of your review, make sure that you describe clearly what you decide to include and exclude, so you know later whether the final results are directly comparable to others or not. Apart from looking at the energy balance of your company, the review should identify potential improvement actions and do a cost-benefit evaluation of these. Now, defining the scope may sound easy, but determining what to include in the review is not always so straightforward, and you will no doubt run into questions here. For example, should I include transportation of people, raw material, or finished products to and from the company? What about activities carried out by my subcontractors, on-site and off-site? And how should I deal with buildings or equipment that I'm only renting? These questions may not have straightforward answers, but the rule of thumb is that if you pay for or control the use of energy related to that activity, then it should be included. And vice versa is also true. If you have no control over the energy usage and do not pay directly for it, then you may exclude it. Having said this, some areas can and should be addressed in cooperation between the parties involved. For example, you can look at energy efficiency measures of a building that you're renting together with a building owner. The challenge here is obviously that no one will want to pay for the review, but you can be sure that all parties are interested in benefiting from the savings that can be achieved. So you need to come to an agreement on how costs and future energy savings will be divided between both parties. Now finally, let's take a look at an example of a scope definition. This sentence shows an example from a review report, and let's read it. The review includes all energy types used by the company within the premises and energy consumed by the company-owned trucks, which means other transportation is excluded. In this case, the company had one company-owned truck, but used several other transport providers as well. In the energy audit, only the company-owned truck was included in the scope, while other transportation was excluded. In this case, the company later had ambitions to benchmark their energy performance against others, but it was soon realized that comparable companies had different solutions when it came to transportation. Some did all the transportation with their own trucks, while others subcontracted all transports. Hence, due to the differences in scope, the performance indicators needed to be adjusted for the transportation to ensure they are comparing apples with apples. Now that you know a little bit more about scope challenges, let's move on and get started with the review, which is explained in the next session.